So I'm here speaking via Zoom with the new artistic director of Griffin Theatre, Declan Greene. Declan, thanks for coming and chatting to me. So crazy time to start a new role. You might be sort of newer to this role at Griffin, but you're certainly no strangers to the Australian stages. Would you want to just kick us off with a little bit of a discussion about your work to date and what you see as important in theatre in Australia today?
Sure. Well, my background is I kind of started out as a playwright, kind of making sort of scratch kind of weirdo queer theatre in Melbourne. I'm with my friend Ash Flanders. We had a theatre company. We have a theatre company still called Sisters Grimm, where we made kind of ludicrous drag theatre in car parks and sound spaces and things like that. And kind of through that creative project, I kind of slowly found my way into making to writing plays for theatre companies. I had some of my earlier plays on at Malthouse, and then also started making Sisters Grimm shows within the context of main stage theatre companies as well. So we did Sisters Grimm shows at like Sydney Theatre Company, Belvoir, and then I started working at Malthouse Theatre as their resident artist. So I worked there as a writer, director, and dramaturg. And I worked there for about 4 years in those roles, kind of working across lots of different projects and also doing my own work at Malthouse as well. And then on the back of that, I started at Griffin after getting the AD job in what was, I think, only about 2 months ago. But at this point, with everything that's happened, feels like it was about a decade ago. Like, so much has happened in the last 2 months. It is truly wild. But it was an amazing thing to land this job just because, I mean, as an artist, I've only ever worked on new Australian plays. I've never done a Shakespeare, I've never done an Arthur Miller, or actually any pre-existing text ever as a director, or worked on a project like that as a dramaturg. So new Australian writing and new Australian stories are the things I love, that I feel most passionately about, and I think are the most important work that goes on stage in Australia. So getting to run a theatre company that is that kind of really important and really essential to our national voice and our identity as a country of artists, it was kind of a dream job.
For me personally, one of the favourite of your shows that I've seen is Nakia Louise Blakey Brown, which was just hilarious and so clever as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that project and working with Nakia? That was a Sydney Theatre Company project, wasn't it? How did that come about, and what was the sort of process and thinking behind it?
Well, like that project just sort of emerged from my friendship with Nakia, which has been, we've been kind of friends since I think like 2008 when we first met at a young playwrights camp. And we both kind of realized that we just had the same kind of messed up sense of humor. And we worked together on a few projects together where Nakia was dramaturg on a couple of Sisters Grimm shows for me and Ash Flanders, who I run Sisters Grimm with. And then I was dramaturg for her on her play Black Showgirls at Malthouse. And then Nakia kind of just, I think one night over drinks told me about this idea that she had for a play that was about an Indigenous archaeologist who discovers the skull of her great-great-grandmother, and is then kind of visited by this vengeful spirit who asks her to get revenge against the descendants of the 4 white kind of colonial settlers who massacred her tribe. So it was effectively coming back in the present day and murdering all the descendants. I just saw the questions that play asked about like culpability and reparation and reconciliation were so incredible and incendiary and asked in such a kind of funny comic book framework that I just thought it was a really, really brilliant project. And it was something Nakia was going to do anyway, but just because I guess we have a fairly similar sense of humor and a fairly similar sensibility and a really good working relationship at that point, it was something that we decided to kind of go in together on with her as a playwright and being as a director. And I think like one of the things that I loved about that play was that I think it was an opportunity for, I think, me as a queer theatre maker and Nakia as a Gamilaroi Torres Strait Islander woman and playwright to kind of find this common language for theatre making, which became about kind of like camp, essentially going like, that became this kind of like really interesting and fertile meeting ground for our taste and our kind of instincts as makers. That we essentially did this something that was kind of really tacky and explosive and over the top and ludicrous, but also kind of had this heart of kind of kind of like anger and truth to it, which I think is like kind of deeply camp and deeply queer in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's right. It was a very, very clever way to make some really interesting points, and the design in that production was amazing. So, so how do you see that your work as a director and working with people like Nakia, and how do you see that transitioning into your role as an artistic director of a company?
Well, I'm really like, when I was at Malthouse over those 4 years, I worked as a dramaturg as much as I worked as a director and as much as I worked as a writer while I was there. And bringing my practice as a dramaturg to Griffin is something that's pretty, I think, key to wanting to take the role on. In that I kind of really, I mean, Griffin is a theatre company for playwrights, and new play development is obviously really key to what we do. But because we are such a little company, and since 2015, during the Brandis era, our capacity to commission and develop really got cut quite deeply. So I guess what I really want to focus on while I'm here is making sure that I can use my time and the time of the associate artist of the company to really make sure that we're putting as much of our kind of energy into working and collaborating deeply with playwrights and giving them our kind of time and as much knowledge as we can to kind of build a bespoke process of development hand in hand with playwrights while they're here in the company, which is maybe not a very kind of like interesting or radical thing to to bring in, but I guess it's just to say that I just really want to make sure that there's a really deep process of interrogation and development that goes into every play that happens on our stage. And I mean, that was something that happened with Blackie Blackie Brown as well. Like from that first kind of the inception of that idea when Nakia had it, that was probably a process of about like 3 or 4 years before that play was ready to actually be on the stage. And I'm totally supportive and totally interested in that kind of like long form development and recognizing that plays, especially for writers who are who have work that's intersecting with their identity in some way, or work that is saying stuff that's politically complex, that you really do have to operate in a way that's kind of not rushed and give people time to find exactly the right way to tell the story.
The next thing I was going to ask you about is the relationship between Griffin and Riverside, and your relationship with Riverside. And it's actually a really interesting way to go, because I think the only one of your works that we've actually had at Riverside is another one that really sort of opens things up for the audience and interrogates things in a really interesting way, and that was Hamlet, Prince of Skidmark. So you said, it's quite funny because you said before, I've never tackled Shakespeare, and I almost pulled you up on that and said, well, hang on a minute, didn't you tackle Shakespeare with the listies in Hamlet, Prince of Skidmark?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'd ever say I directed Shakespeare, because if you saw that play, it definitely wasn't Shakespeare.
Oh, yeah, it was about as far from Hamlet. I remember with STC, when we programmed it for education audiences, I remember having to think very, very carefully through the marketing of that as to how we could tell it to schools.
To infer that there's any... Yeah, I think the notion of that play as having any educational value is it's probably kind of a stretch. But at the same time, I actually do think that play did have some really interesting educational value. It just kind of wasn't there in the kind of meat of the text itself necessarily. But I loved doing that play. That was so much fun. And it was like, it was also, I'd known the listies in Melbourne for years and years and years, and had been friends with Matt and Rich. And I think that came about because STC just asked me if I was interested in doing a kids show. And I was like, maybe, but I'd only want to do it with the listies, because I love that they do kids shows that are like, they're really not worthy and they're not kind of like magical at all. They're super dirty and super puerile and super punk. And I think that if you were taking a kids to see a listies show, I think the kind of love of theatre it fosters is really important, like a love of liveness and anarchy and the fact that things could fall apart at any second, or that the audience could, if they wanted to, swarm the stage, as did happen every single performance of Hamlet, Princess Skidmark. And I thought it was kind of like a cool and interesting way to kind of use Hamlet as kind of like the archetypal like piece of theatre. Like it's the idea of a piece of theatre that substitutes for all pieces of theatre, and its kind of grandness and its worthiness and how important it is to the canon to kind of smuggle some of those ideas across the border.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it was a great show. I think I saw it with a schools audience. I definitely remember it was a schools show, and I remember sort of the teachers letting themselves kind of relax and enjoy it. I definitely remember that experience.
Yeah, totally. And also, I think the funny thing about doing it as well was that like Rich in particular, Richard Higgins, actually does love Shakespeare, like really does love Shakespeare. I think one of the things he loved about doing it too was going like, it was like, in a weird way, this is so even more in the spirit of Shakespeare than a lot of high culture Shakespeare. Going like, you know, it really did feel like it was a production that was made for the groundlings. Like it was, because it was so built for a contemporary attention span, and so about showing like, yeah, we're just going to do something kind of knockabout that's really kind of cheap and nasty and funny. And that kind of was what a lot of Shakespeare was in the time.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's one of the things that sort of pushing the boundaries and using all the sort of the techniques and technology that's available now, I think is one of the things, certainly one of the things I've seen in your work with Will Blackbeck Brown in this one. And I know what you guys have been working on at the moment through the lockdown is certainly challenging and pushing the boundaries and stretching the modes of delivery for theatre. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what Griffin's been working on in the lockdown with your Lockin series and what else you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, so when the lockdown happened, we partnered with Google to commission 5 different artists to build new works for live broadcast in just a week and a half. They had a week and a half to make these new works. And to broadcast over 1 week, and we called the program Griffin Lockin. And it was kind of, you know, this thing where the audience would just, at 7 o'clock at the time we normally would do a show, would essentially log onto our YouTube page, and they would just watch this thing, and they didn't really know what it was going to be, or anything other than really who the artist was. But we'd ask the artist to respond to a very specific set of parameters around, I guess, liveness. It was really kind of an experiment about liveness and going like, how do you create a feeling of what is essential to theatre, like the feeling that you and the performers are seeing something that's unrepeatable and that's ephemeral and that's happening in the moment and can never be repeated again when you're not in the same space together. So all the artists kind of took on that challenge and did something really, really different. And I was sort of really, I guess I was fascinated about it because I guess for me, one of the things that's really interesting about looking at live streaming technology is that it inherently kind of breaks down a lot of barriers that are there in terms of accessibility for theatre, like both in terms of financial accessibility, because for something like Lockin, it was free, and you could, in future incarnations, it could be, you know, your overheads to make the show are a lot cheaper for a theatre company, so more people could afford to see it if you did decide to continue rolling out and making work for that format. Also, I think that there are, it answers other questions about accessibility for disabled and neurodiverse folk. And obviously theatre has a lot, the main stage theatre has a lot of work to do in that regard anyway, in terms of bridging a pretty noticeable gap there. But it does mean for people who don't find it as easy to leave their house, there is kind of a way to still kind of be involved in theatre and have theatre actually, it's not just made for that format in terms of like putting a camera on a play that already exists. It's like going, you are not missing out on anything by not being in the space, because this is made for exactly the space that it's being performed in, which is the internet or a live stream. So I don't know, it's something that I thought was really, really interesting. I loved what all of the artists made, and it's something that I'm kind of really interested in looking at. I guess looking at the value of kind of as we move forward. So we've been kind of like looking at that on one hand, kind of looking at how we as a company might kind of harness live broadcast and building work for that format in the future, while also kind of just bunkering down and doing a lot more kind of script development stuff for when we can reopen again. So we've been working on yeah, like on just helping, engaging in lots of conversations with writers, reading a lot of scripts, and working on the work that we know we are going to be staging in the immediate future, like at the end of this year, just helping the writers get those, refine those plays for eventual presentation.
Yeah, that's great. And how did it go from an audience point of view with the live, the lock-in?
I mean, it was amazing. Like we had 10,000 people watched it all in all, which for a theatre like Griffin, like if we completely sell out a season, that's not 10,000.
Yeah.
That's not 10,000 people seeing the work because we're such an itty bitty little theatre company. So it was pretty mind blowing in that respect. We're like going, my God, like the ceiling on this is so much higher than doing things in a physical space. And I think the other thing that was really interesting about it that I didn't necessarily predict was that I kind of assumed that we had to make the performances heavily interactive to make the audience feel like the work was live and that they were really participating in it. And you know, that it could be kind of changeable, its outcomes could be changeable. But I think one of the things that was really amazing that I discovered was that, like, when you're live streaming something on YouTube, you have this chat box on the right hand side where users can just like comment and write things during the performance. And that was amazing. I was totally blown away by like how active people were in that space and how that actually did give the feeling of liveness. The fact that when something amazing happened in the performance, everybody could just go like, oh my God, that was great, or do applause emojis or do smiley emojis. And you could feel everybody watching it and you could feel everybody moving as one and going like, I think that's one of the most precious and important things to preserve, one of the most ancient things that we have to preserve about theatre and its dynamics. And I don't think I anticipated that that actually could be achieved when you're not all in the one place. It was sort of amazing.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And it's a really good sort of way to move into the next question. So yes, it's the statement that you made about never underestimate the audience. And it was made in a fantastic conversation in response to Wesley Enoch's Nick Enright speech, and it was about the function of comedy and why use comedy and how does comedy work specifically for audiences. And I just thought it was such a fantastic discussion. I really wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, about how you approach the audience. I mean, there's no such thing as the audience, but audiences, and is there one particular thing you try to achieve in your work when it, you know, to the audience?
I think there's never really any one thing I'm trying to achieve with the audience, but I think every show I do, I think of it like I'm playing a game with the audience of some kind, that there is an exchange that has to be really, really core to the work. It's not like you're just like putting something up on stage and going like, this is happening for the void and the audience can make of it what they want. I don't find that very interesting as a theatre maker. I always want to be like, what game are we playing together in this show? And what am I giving the audience? Like, what is the act of kind of generosity and exchange and love I'm trying to give the people who are watching this show, which I think is like partly related just to the big kind of existential question of theatre in general, because it's getting harder and harder to convince people to leave their houses, and entertainment is so much cheaper on Netflix and Stan and other formats that means you don't actually have to leave your house. So what is it about being in this live space together that makes a really strong, powerful argument for people to spend that extra bit of money and leave a more comfortable space? And so I think that places, I think as a theatre maker making stuff in 2020 and 2021, you have to really kind of accept that as a challenge and be like, I'm really going to give people a reason to leave the house and come to this space. And a lot of the time in my work, like the answer to that is comedy. Like I love making funny work and I love making audiences laugh, and very few things make me happier in a theatre, in my practice as a writer or a director, than like really nailing a perfect gag and and having the audience laugh along with that. But it doesn't have to be that either. It could just be that you're making people cry together or feel suspense or feel terror or dread or get them out of their seats and doing something. But it's either way, I think it's really important that as theatre makers, we're thinking about theatre as generously and as an act of kind of love and community with the audiences that we're inviting to come and leave their house and do this thing with us.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, we obviously can't wait to have Griffin back at Riverside, and it was absolutely heartbreaking that the first show that we had to put down was Family Values, which again, you know, different kind of work, but you know, it was very close to selling out, and you know, very funny at times and all those things. So we're definitely looking forward to having Griffin back as soon as we can, and seeing what you do as a director. So there's a couple of last questions to kind of end with. What was the last live performance you saw before the closures?
Actually, this is kind of a sad story, but the last performance I saw before the closure, I think, was on about the day before the announcement was made that venues under 100 seats had to close. And I went to see the dress rehearsal and first and final performance of Natasha Somersundaram's play Girlfriend, which was downstairs at Belvoir Theatre. And Natasha she's a Parramatta girl, actually. That's where she grew up. And it was just this like funny and really absurd and really cooked and bizarre kind of absurdist comedy, and a duologue for two amazing actors. And it was so cool and so beautifully made, and just like an exceptional play by an early career playwright. Just one of those things that you're watching, you're like, yes, like this is so exciting, and I want people to see this, and I also can't wait to see what you do next. So it was amazing, but also really bittersweet, because then it didn't actually get to open. But when it does open, I highly recommend people go and see Girlfriend. It's really, really cool. I'm sure it'll be back. Great.
That's a great watch this space. Okay. Do you have a favourite moment, or can you remember a moment from Riverside theatres when you've been with us in Parramatta?
Obviously I love seeing Hamlet, Bridge of Skidmark there, and getting to see those kids swarm the stage was a total highlight. That was great. I also, I think the last show I saw there was Black Cockatoo, which was really gorgeous as well. I love seeing that work, and I loved how, I love the generosity of that work. I love Luke Carroll kind of narrating it and pulling you into this story, and his kind of warmth as a presence on stage and a storyteller was really cool. And that cast was just amazing. It was an incredible ensemble of actors.
And what are you binging right now?
At the moment, I'm obsessively listening to Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, which is just a podcast where they just tell the story very slowly, chapter by chapter, of major historical revolutions, which just feels very pertinent at the moment, because it feels like this could be a time for great social change. So it's interesting to listen to ways that's happened previously throughout our history as a species. There's some hope in that, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. Sort of, it's a time for bigger things and bigger thinking and expansion.
Exactly. Yeah.
Minds and things like that. So, well, thanks so much, Declan. It's been amazing chatting to you. And as I said before, we can't wait to have you and Griffin back with us, and for the doors to open, and also to see what comes next in the online space as well. It's all very exciting.
Yes, yeah, I'm very excited about that too. I'm very, very, I'm super excited to team up with Riverside and to be making some stuff like with and for Western Sydney. I'm really excited to get started on that.
Fantastic.